My name is Lisa. I'm 25 years old and work as an administrative assistant in a mid-sized company. I was born out of my father's affair. Until I was 5, I didn't know this. I was raised thinking that my father's legal wife, Sarah, who was my primary caregiver, was my real mother. Sarah couldn't bear children due to her weak health, and she took in my father's illegitimate child, which is me. When I decided to take you in, it was actually very painful for me. But when I learned that your real mother had died in a traffic accident caused by my husband's driving mistake, I couldn't just leave you alone. She confessed to me when I was 5, and she was ill in bed. Apparently, when my father and my real mother, his mistress, were out driving, he made a driving error and crashed into a utility pole. My mother, who was in the passenger seat, suffered a heavy blow to her chest and passed away. You know, at the time of the accident, you were still in your real mother's womb, Sarah continued. When you were born by emergency surgery, I thought, this child is a miracle, so I made up my mind to raise you properly. Your grandparents wanted to take you in, but I firmly stated that I would raise you. At that time, I was only 5 years old. I couldn't fully comprehend the situation, but I did understand that the woman I thought was my real mother wasn't, and yet she had raised me with love. She always made delicious homemade sweets for me, crafted cute clothes, and even slept with me when I was too afraid to sleep alone. I dearly loved Sarah. When Sarah passed away, I, still 5 years old, was entrusted to the care of my biological maternal grandparents. Later, my grandmother told me that my father had been having an affair with a woman named Carol for several years. When Sarah passed away, she quickly moved in and apparently told my father to abandon me. Perhaps I was a burden to my father because he pushed me off onto my real grandparents. At first, it was nerve-wracking for me to meet my grandparents as they were strangers to me. But my grandparents, who bore a striking resemblance to my real mother, took very good care of me. My father, who had acknowledged me as his child at birth and taken me in, seemed to have no interest in children at all, as I have no memories of him playing with me. On the other hand, my grandmother often said, "Lisa, you're such a good girl. Grandpa's so happy that you're his granddaughter," and he frequently brought me toys and sweets. My grandmother, like Sarah, was good at baking sweets, and she made anything I requested by hand. Her sweets looked and tasted quite different from Sarah's, and as a young child, I would selfishly say, "Grandma, I don't really like this." But my grandmother never scolded me. Instead, she smiled and said, "It's fun to know different tastes, isn't it?" What made me happiest was that they told me various things about my birth mother. My real mother met my father, the son of an executive at the company she worked at, while she was working. My father was a promising and competent individual, but he was known for his wild affairs with women. My mother, unfortunately, got caught up with it. When my father was proposed to marry Sarah, a well-bred young lady, my mother intended to break up with him. But my father would throw out cheesy lines like, "You're the only one I truly love," and during the course of our drawn-out relationship, I got pregnant. My mother, who was told by him, "I'll acknowledge the child, but I can't marry you," made a firm decision to break up and raise the child on her own. Apparently, they had this conversation in a car my father was driving, and he made a mistake, causing an accident. Lisa's mom was really an earnest and admirable daughter, but she was played and torn apart by that man. My grandmother seems really regretful when talking about it. "But you left us with a wonderful granddaughter named Lisa, so we have to be thankful for that." I think deep down, my grandmother hesitated to take me in, who had the blood of the man who had abandoned her precious daughter and took her life. But she never showed such feelings and loved me with all her heart. When they took me in, my grandparents were in their early 50s. My grandfather ran a small factory, and while they weren't wealthy, they were able to lead a decent life. Also, about 5 years after they took me in, it seems that several thousands of dollars were transferred every month from my father as child support. But at some point, those payments stopped, and around the same time, the factory's business began to decline. My grandmother, who had been a housewife, started working, but it seems it wasn't enough to get the factory's finances back on track. Eventually, they had to sell the factory and their home, and by the time I was in middle school, we had moved to an old apartment. My grandmother would say, "Our grandparents lived really meager lives during the war times. Compared to that, we're totally fine," and even cut down on their own meals to make sure I had plenty to eat. Once I entered high school, I started working part-time too. I was really happy to receive unsold items at the supermarket where I worked until 8 p.m. The part-time ladies were also very kind to me, secretly giving me damaged daily necessities during delivery and giving me hand-me-down clothes from their daughters, saying it was old, but despite being poor, it was a really fun life. But that happiness ended when my grandfather fell ill. His disease progressed quickly, and in no time he was hospitalized. He was told he had only half a year to live, and money quickly drained due to his medical and hospital bills. My grandfather had canceled his life insurance shortly after closing the factory to save money. Distressed, I bought a magazine that introduced night jobs, seriously considering doing it. But when my grandmother found the magazine, she slapped my cheek while crying and saying, "I don't want money so badly that I would let Lisa do something like that," and I came to my senses. But what other methods were there? In the end, my grandmother bowed her head to all her relatives and arranged for the money, but I felt really pathetic for not being able to help at all. For a moment, I thought of relying on my father, but I wasn't told where my father was. I haven't had any contact since I parted ways with him when I was 5, and my grandparents should not have been in contact either. If only I knew the name of the company where my father worked, I could have ambushed him. But thinking about it, I only have memories up to the age of 5, so I wouldn't have recognized my father even if he walked in front of me. My grandfather passed away 6 months later. My grandmother and I had to downsize to a smaller and cheaper apartment. After graduating from high school, I started working around the clock. I worked as an office clerk during weekdays, a supermarket employee in the evenings, and a convenience store worker on the weekends. Sure, there were occasions when coworkers and fellow part-timers confessed their feelings for me, but I ended up calculating how much I could earn in the time I'd spend on a date. Perhaps it was because of the trauma of my father being a terrible man. I had a slight distrust of men, and I wasn't interested in dating anyone. My grandmother would often tell me with a warm smile, "Not all men are as bad as him. Even when I'm gone, I want you to be happy. I hope you find someone wonderful, but there's no need to rush." Time passed and I turned 25. I was still poor and without a boyfriend, but my life with my grandmother was peaceful. Out of the blue, we received a phone call intended for my grandmother. Making a strange face, my grandmother spoke into the phone. After she hung up, she turned to me and said softly, "Lisa, your dad passed away." Apparently, he had collapsed at work and passed away soon after. The woman who had called was my mother and father's old colleague. She was still working at the same company as my father and knew about me. She had taken the trouble to inform us. But honestly, I felt no shock at all. It doesn't really concern me, right? I mean, I'm adopted by you and Grandpa. I have no ties with that man. That's not entirely true. You'll understand when the matter of inheritance comes up. Inheritance? His? I don't want the money of the man who caused so much suffering to my biological and foster mothers. I swore to myself I would never accept it. A week ago, my father's last wife, Carol, called. Just as I had suspected, she brought up the subject of inheritance. "I didn't want to contact you, but one of my husband's colleagues told you about his death, so I had no choice but to call you because there's an issue with the inheritance." She began her spiel. In other words, if my mother's friend hadn't reached out, we wouldn't have known about my father's death, and Carol probably planned to keep all the inheritance. "Would you mind renouncing your right to the inheritance?" She began her cold, calculated speech. "I was the one who took care of him until the end, after all. You lived far away and did nothing. Don't you think you don't deserve it?" I heard that she had only cared for him for a few days after his heart attack. "Also, didn't he pay child support? That should be enough," she added. Actually, he was supposed to pay for 15 years, but stopped after only 5. "You're the one who was adopted into another family, right? You severed ties with my husband. Isn't it brazen of you to want to claim his money?" The more she spoke, the more I could feel her greed. I didn't want to talk to this money grubber any longer. I didn't want the money from the cruel, heartless man who had abandoned me. With that thought in mind, I answered her dismissively. "Okay, I already thought of him as a stranger." "Oh, thank goodness you've understood." The jubilant voice of Carol came from the receiver, but at the same time, my grandmother snatched the phone away and yelled into the mouthpiece. "You must be joking. We won't renounce anything. If you want to start trouble, we'll hire a lawyer and fight you." Wait, what? While I was still startled, my grandmother hung up the phone with a slam. "Grandma, why aren't we renouncing it?" Then my grandmother smiled sweetly and began to explain slowly. "That woman said you cut ties by going into adoption, didn't she? But that's not true. First, understand that you have the right to inherit the man's property." I didn't quite understand where she was going with this, but she continued. "You went through a regular adoption. That means your relationship with your previous parent doesn't end, even though you were adopted." Huh? Is that true? There are special adoptions and regular adoptions. In a special adoption, the relationship with the original parents is severed. However, in a regular adoption, the relationship continues, so you actually end up having 2 sets of parents, your original parents and your adoptive ones. When we were deciding whether to adopt you, we were torn. If we went with a regular adoption, you might have been obligated to take care of that man if he needed it. You wouldn't want that, would you? The man who abandoned my biological mother, who started an affair with my adoptive mother, Sarah, was still alive. I definitely wouldn't want to care for such a man. But, that man was an elite in a major corporation, and it was clear from his lifestyle that he was quite wealthy. That means if we went into a regular adoption, when that man passed away, there would be a good chance that a significant amount of money would come to you through inheritance. We thought, even if you had to struggle to care for that man, you might be rewarded in the end. Your grandfather and I discussed it and made the decision. I was moved to tears when I realized how much they had thought about me. But I don't want his inheritance. You may be angry thinking about it as that man's inheritance, but what if you think of it as money? You know very well how necessary and important money is for living, Lisa, after all these 20 years. That was certainly true. If we had money, we could have given my grandfather better treatment, and we wouldn't have had to make my grandmother live in this rundown apartment. No matter how hard I worked as a high school graduate, I couldn't make life easier for my grandmother. Right, I need money to make life easier for you, Grandma. It's not about me, Lisa. You can never have too much money for your future happiness. If you really can't bear it, why not donate the money after you receive it? There are plenty of people who need it, right? That was really true. My grandmother, who had struggled with money, would know the importance of money more than anyone. I changed my mind. I won't renounce, I'll fight for my rightful inheritance. Then I started doing some research about inheritance. A question arose in my mind. Grandma, can you tell me the phone number of the woman who informed us about that man's collapse? Sure, but what are you going to do? I have something I want to ask her. With a bright smile, I immediately dialed that person's number. A few days later, I called Carol and informed her of my valid claim to the inheritance. If you say you won't let me inherit, I'll hire a lawyer and proceed with a lawsuit, I warned her. This made her frantic with anger. Given her reaction, the inheritance must be quite substantial. Only getting half, oh my goodness. Too bad, I said, and then hung up the phone. After that, I embarked on the action I had planned. I speculated that my dad, given his lack of discipline with women, might have been continuously unfaithful. So, I contacted the woman who had informed me of the man's passing and had her investigate his affairs. And it came out that he had been simultaneously cheating with at least 5 women at work. 2 of them, it seemed, had even been proposed to. So I decided to have them claim compensation addressed to our late father. When compensation is claimed, if the person being claimed against has passed away, their heirs must pay it. This means in this case, Carol and I, as the heirs, are obligated to pay. The compensation claims from the 5 women will probably total nearly $20 million, so Carol's and my inheritance will each decrease by $10 million. It doesn't really matter to me, but as for Carol... And there's one more thing. This man had not paid child support for about 10 years. In this case, the unpaid amount is inherited, so again, it must be paid from the inheritance. The lawyer said, let's push as hard as we can, and promptly claimed about $10 million. The thought of Carol throwing a hysterical fit made me chuckle. And then, to make matters worse, Carol, in her haste, started investing in stocks and fell for an investment scam, losing almost all of the inheritance. Now, it seems, she's barely getting by, living in a dilapidated, tiny one-room apartment over 50 years old, struggling with debt. What goes around comes around, right? Afterwards, with the inheritance I received, I renovated my grandmother's house and we're living together comfortably. I donated part of the remaining money to institutions like child welfare facilities. Recently, a friend of my mom brought me several matchmaking opportunities since she was worried about me. I started dating one of them and now live a happy life every day.